Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Pride Month at York Youth. Today is day 4 of Artists and Activism talks presented by SexGen. My name is Marvin, your MC for the week, and today we have an exciting presentation that will take up themes on spoken word, activism, and healing. Also, if you want to catch our previous talks, you can visit yorku.ca/YU Pride. Before I begin today's land acknowledgement, I want to honor the spirits of the Indigenous children who were found and the remains that were uncovered, witnessing the violence at the encampment raids at Bellwoods. There is a sense of rage and urgency that lingers as I approach today's land acknowledgement. And so I want to offer this with an awareness of our collective and creative resilience, and with the hope that we continue to protect and care for one another, for the land, and our First Nations communities. As this event is virtual, we are not all gathered in the same space. I recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. We ask that if this is the case, you take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you are on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Takaranto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. From what I understand, this land was appropriated by the British Crown in a series of deceitful treaties, most famously the Toronto Purchase of 1805, which cheated the Mississaugas out of a portion of this land for 10 shillings. What's more, a large portion of Toronto is unceded. For those of us who are settlers on this land, it's our collective responsibility to recognize that we are here because this land is occupied. In recognizing that this space occupies colonized First Nations territories, and out of respect for the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples, it is our collective responsibility to learn our colonial histories and their present-day implications and continuities. It is also important to acknowledge that in addition to taking land and sovereignty from Indigenous nations, white settler colonialism as centrally involved in posing white ways of being and displacing diverse Indigenous ones. These colonial impositions include monogamous heterosexuality, the nuclear family structure, authoritarian, undemocratic, and physically violent means of wielding power between adults and children and between men and women and the binary gender system. They also include the imposition of capitalism, the racist and classist criminal justice system, including the criminalization of sex work and drugs, the psychiatric system, which makes reasonable human suffering into individual pathology, and the practice of strangers deciding whether families and communities are safer for children and then forcibly removing them if the stranger decides that that's the best thing for the child. These are all everyday manifestations of ongoing colonialism which we have a responsibility to both acknowledge and struggle against. Thank you. Now I want to hand it over to our wonderful SexGen committee, Chris and Jin. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marvin. Hi, Jin.
Hi, thanks so much, Marvin.
Welcome everyone to day 4 of 5 lunchtime Pride events organized by SexGen York and a number of other partners that we work with, who we will either name now or at the very end. I think maybe at the end. Thank you to the ASL interpreters. Thank you to Lukayo and Cass for speaking today. I'm really looking forward to hearing you both speak.
Yes.
And we wanted to tell you that there is at 2 o'clock today, there is an event being held by the Center for Sexual Violence Response and Education. It is a support event specifically for Pride, and I believe today it is a mindfulness event. Is that correct, Jim?
Scott Hope today.
Oh, okay, fantastic.
Yes.
Sorry for getting them mixed up.
No, you're right. It is mindful meditation.
Oh, with Scott Pope. Okay.
With Scott Pope. Yes.
So that's at 2 o'clock, and maybe someone from the center can post that for fantastic. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
And tomorrow at this same time, so from 11:30 to approximately 1 o'clock, we will have Pusha Dedoy and Mocha Dawkins coming for our final event, and then Two-Spirit Pre-Elder Blue Waters, who opened our event rather on Monday, will be closing tomorrow after the speakers. So that's it. Yeah, we're really excited to be here. Happy Pride, everyone, and we will turn it back to Marvin, I believe. Is that right, Jen?
Yes, happy Pride, and can't wait for today. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chris. Before we introduce our next speaker, actually, I believe it is Carolyn Steele who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you, Carolyn.
It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Cassandra Myers, who goes by the pronouns they, she. She is a queer, trans, crip, mad, South Asian, Italian poet, performer, educator, and social worker from Toronto, Ontario. A Master's of Social Work candidate at York University, Cassandra has performed poetry across the United States and Canada. A Pink Door Fellow, her work can be found in Overheard, The Short Line Review, Uncommon View, and elsewhere. Thank you so much for joining us today, Cassandra. I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Carolyn and folks at York. Hi, y'all. My name's Cass. I use they and she pronouns. I'm going to open my segment with a poem. This poem is called Offering, and it can be found to be read on ARC Poetry Magazine's 2021 Poem of the Year Award shortlist. If you are on YouTube right now and would like to read along, if you're in the live stream with us, we have a link that was just posted in the chat to read along with us. This poem does discuss issues of border, issues of being undocumented, of being disabled. So just a content warning for folks to take care. It details the experience of my partner and I trying to get her really important medicine while she was undocumented and being harassed by border officers. This poem is called Offering. They make me question the ring on my finger, the I do belong on this side of a promise, the border, its serrated edge, a tripwire my love jump ropes monthly for medicine. She is a stateless doe in the jaw of a nation playing chicken with excuses for entry and exit, but can't cite my last name. If only her car could slip through the meat of a lie like the syringe, entering the soft country of her freckled thigh, never interrogating the vein as a legal host. When my wife and I are pulled over at the northern flypaper, the fence demands her name tossed towards a bloodline wearing the border officer's face. There is nothing a border won't steal. Splitting is its birthright. It takes by law of shattering. Gorges on hot cars rusting at its chin. Hoards applications to wipe its oily mouth. Entry, a map folded along the estuaries of longing. A ticket is nothing but a trade of all that crops from my touch. I spin a feast of gold from the pit of me to satiate the globe maker's need for locks. Here, take my Nana's golden curry. Take Aunt Audrey's silk doll. Take my father's home-glazed kati. Take a slice of our wedding cake. Take the buttercream straight from the corners of my mouth in the photo. Take my left breast and its dandelion milk. Take my hand writing down the recipe, but do not take the book where it is written. Do not take my love, placing that jewel on its shelf. How can I snap what is drawn in the sand? The officers, with all that barb in their speech, say her name like a chain link curse, and I am pressing oxbow motes into my palms, waiting for a drawbridge to wink. I want to get home to my wife without dialing up her cheeks. I bring my vows, but all I can carry across is her laugh, dancing in a voicemail. I blink away from her face, even for an eyelash second, faster than a door slamming a wailing anthem. But all I'm guaranteed is my own hands reaching through a fence. Yeah, thank you all so much. That poem's really tender and close to my heart, considering it is Pride Month, but not Pride for all of us. Issues of migration and borders created by colonialism, by the false nation state, so-called Canada, get in the way of queer folks living their fullest lives, disabled folks living their fullest lives every day. And specifically when we're talking about Indigenous sovereignty, working towards ending colonial borders and enforcing Indigenous sovereignty is something I hope that we are bringing into our work this month as queer folks, as allies. In the chat, we're going to just post a link to Jay Simpson's poetry, their first book, what was just released, called It Was Never Not Going to Be Okay. And you can pick up that book to show support for Indigenous artists this month, queer and trans Indigenous artists. So today, we're going to be speaking about spoken word and virability. The word spoken word as a name for my art is something I've been really struggling with lately. Spoken word specifically in the context of Turtle Island is vastly and in a deep lineage as a Black and Indigenous art form. It comes from a history of dub poetry in Jamaica, a breakbeat movement, the hip hop movement, the Harlem Renaissance, comes from oral tradition in resistance to enslavement and resistance to colonization. And as a guest in the House of Spoken Word, as a person who is not Black or Indigenous, but South Asian migrant and Italian on this space, I'm wrestling with what it means to call myself a spoken word artist, which really isn't a conversation that is happening within the spoken word community, but maybe let me say the slam poetry community, which is the community that I specifically came up in. I would call myself a slam poet probably before I would call myself a spoken word artist, but there is a politic within the arts community in terms of like granting above all else, that slam poetry, because it's a competition, is not considered a art form that can be funded. So slam poets or folks who have come up in organizing slam poetry spaces have had to call themselves spoken word artists to get that access to grant funding for running their organizations, their programming, or their own artistic careers. Whereas spoken word artists, because of that lineage, slam poets weren't exactly invited into spoken word poetry. Slam poetry was started by a white man whose name we will not speak of because he's very racist and has proven himself to be time and time again. A white man in Chicago, basically, who was like, you know, an open mic is boring. We should make it a game, a competition, and therefore we should put numbers to people's life story and create an arbitrary scoring system where the audience, folks who were just bar goers back then, will be able to decide on the value of the performer's art, which is not in a lineage of spoken word, which was about community, about resistance, about collective organizing and collective action. Slam poetry in its origins, like, removed that mobility or like that mobilizing force to take the route of entertainment, to take the route of being a fun experience to get people in the door. And it was really successful. I was drawn into slam poetry like for those same reasons, specifically because of the audience participation, the audience interaction, of course, that was built by largely Black folks and folks of color who started their own slams to create an atmosphere of community in which the poet who is performing receives feedback from the audience through cheers, calls and responses, through encouragement, and the kind of energy that is in a poetry slam is electric, is so delicious and enticing. And as a young person who is fresh out of high school, just moved from Richmond Hill back to Toronto where my parents grew up, I was looking for a place to call my own, and slam poetry welcomed me into that space. Specifically, I was at Up From the Roots Lounge, which is no longer really active, but I was able to find a community of other racialized folks who were calling upon really crucial and important things at the time. I'd never really been introduced to social justice growing up in Catholic school my whole life. It was very much so, you know, build a school in a country that's not your own as social justice. And coming into slam poetry and spoken word, I realized that this was about spreading discourse in an accessible way. It was about speaking against racism, speaking against violence, speaking against homophobia, oppression in general, and mobilizing an audience to action through the person's personal narrative, but also their highly political critique. And that was how I learned about a lot of what some might call anti-oppressive or social justice discourse. It wasn't in my social work classes that I was in at the time, but it was at the poetry slam where I was around other QT BIPOC young people who were talking about their lived experience while also incorporating what they were learning from their university settings in a classroom, while also bringing in their community experience, their community discourse. And sometimes, I would even say often, actively resisting and speaking against an academic canon, especially in the context of Canada, where poetry is so gate-kept by academic whiteness, by folks who consider themselves part of a very exclusive group of literature, of literary artists, and folks who performed their poetry, who were speaking to their own communities as opposed to trying to be published in a journal, we're finding refuge in this space that was kind of created for us and by us in a lot of ways. But of course, any space, even though if racialized folks are running it, gets complicated as it becomes more popular, as it becomes more enticing to folks who don't understand those roots, who don't understand that lineage of spoken word as being something of resistance, as being something that mobilizes folks, but also requires you to be involved in other ways in the movement. So I want to speak a little bit about how this slam poetry shift towards capitalism has influenced virality. I think I came into spoken word kind of at the height of virality as an audience member. So for folks who do watch spoken word, on YouTube specifically was where I entered. I was watching button poetry. I was watching Slam Find. I was watching Brave New Voices, which is a youth poetry festival clips. And I was so enticed and drawn in by the way that specifically slam poetry has called us to take our art form and incorporate a lot of other art forms into it. And this is because of the slam poetry structure, which is highly competitive. If we're talking even about a youth slam that I was involved in when I was first coming into slam poetry, I would go to competitions with thousands of young people, and we would be put in kind of like bouts, almost like mini competitions, and you'd have to move up the ranks with hopes of getting to that final stage. And you would go to these competitions and pray that button poetry would be at your bout filming, which we never knew where they were going to show up, hoping that maybe your poem would be then selected from the hundreds of poems that were filmed at that festival and end up on button poetry and possibly be seen by thousands and millions of people across the world and essentially like cement your career as an artist. I was fed the narrative of starving artists, and especially in Canada, we have more granting systems for spoken word artists, but to become viral, it required us to enter competitions in the States, just because they had that platform available to them. That was built through necessity because they don't have granting systems in the States. So they had to become viral. They had to garner a very large social media following, audience to sell books, to tour, to sell out major shows. And what we were finding, or what I've witnessed growing up in the slam poetry community, is that there's like a system of, I guess like gatekeeping is really the only word that can be said, is that you have to compete through multiple rounds of local slams to national slams, then even regional slams to be seen and to be heard. And of course, when you have an art form that was created by a white man, or like a structure, let's say a structure of art, of ingesting art that was created by a white man, the audience also is just folks who are interested in slam poetry, or maybe we're looking for something fun to do that night, and they're looking for entertainment. So certain poems, certain topics, certain bodies are garnered that virality, are made to pass through those rankings. And if you look at button poetry right now, the most viral videos, or top 5 most viewed, are all white folks. And that has been like a consistent challenge. The #1 most viewed spoken word video on button poetry is a white man, and specifically white folks talking about madness through the lens of love, has a lot of virality and a lot of attraction, because talking about, I think, like anxiety or stress or tensions with parents can be spread to a wide audience in the same way any white character in a film can be spread to a white audience, especially if they're not presenting as queer, if they are presenting as cisgender. And for example, folks in Canada, Sabrina Benaim is one of the first people to ever go viral on button poetry, and she is a Canadian poet who has for a long time been writing love poems as a white woman, and getting on that national stage in the States. She now is able to tour with very viral poets as well, and gets a lot of screen time on button poetry itself or other YouTube platforms. But for my generation, who was just below that by like 2 or 3 years, we found that there was this peak of virality online where when there was only one video account that was taking content from our slams and posting it online, as there were other accounts popping up to post more content, there was a saturation of content. And because of that saturation of content, of course, in the same way that YouTube algorithms or TikTok algorithms will prioritize certain bodies and certain topics, we're finding that queer and trans voices are not making it through, specifically queer and trans racialized, queer and trans Black bodies are not getting that same virality, especially when they're talking about things that are challenging, that are not easily agreeable to an audience, especially when it challenges racism, when it calls out whiteness, when it challenges its audience to be mobilized beyond maybe some kind of, like everyday feminism approach. And I think for myself as a spoken word artist or a slam poet, let's say, a slam poet who my poetry that's online is mostly about survivorship. My poetry about survivorship is not for entertainment. My goal isn't actually to get a lot of people to watch my poetry because one, that would put me in danger. I don't want my family possibly to see that content, but also I want to talk about survivorship in a very nuanced way. I was talking about survivorship from the perspective of when you return to someone who has caused you harm in the past, when you're trying to repair that relationship, which is not a revenge poem, which to an audience that wants a clear-cut answer or wants entertainment, I felt called to constantly lean into punishment or violence for the people that caused me harm. Which is not to say that those approaches are necessary or required or should stop happening for anyone who is a survivor and is making slam poetry or spoken word poetry about that content. But virality prevents nuance from creeping in because of algorithms, because of the way that, like myself, more folks were welcomed into slam poetry because of YouTube and the internet. That means that more of us are trying to get screen time and less of us are ending up with that screen time. And it becomes really challenging, especially because that reflects into our own communities. In the same way that certain folks' voices aren't making it on YouTube, certain folks' voices aren't making it onto our final stages at our events. So we have to create events where, femme folks can go and only perform their poetry with each other. And the way that art becomes maybe, and I don't want to say the word evolve, but it grows, is that we see tenderness, we see nuance, we see people being soft, we see people not feeling called to overperform or to sacrifice certain lines that are just for ourselves. In the way that when I was being coached under slam poetry was asking us to make content as easily digestible as possible. And as someone who is moving also towards the page and growing inward with a very small collective of queer and trans folks of color artists, it especially feels important for me to acknowledge that not all of my poetry is going to be digestible or ever go viral. And that's okay for me, because I think that Kimon Felix talked about poetry as being a loneliness beacon. And I think there are a lot of us who are queer and trans and racialized and survivors and disabled, especially. We know isolation so intimately. And we know that our stories aren't palatable for everyone. And we've been posting our stories on Tumblrs and blog posts and in our own Finstas forever. And it's those people that my poetry is hoping to reach. And it's that audience that I feel called to listen to as well. So when we're talking about spoken word or slam poetry and virality, I'm highly encouraging folks to search up their local artists, specifically like check out their slam poetry scenes. Some folks I would want to plug super quickly before I wrap up is artists who are also doing the work on the front lines as they are on stage. And those artists include Malika Awari, Jada Marley, Jennifer Alicia, Randall and Jai, Jillian Christmas. Go check those folks out because you will see those folks at the Not Another Black Life protest doing that frontline activism as much as we would see them at any kind of slam. So I'm gonna close on a note of joy, of embracing myself and my kin. This poem is called Lake Baptiste Ungenders Me. You can again find it in the chat, or you can look it up at ARC Poem of the Year Awards Shortlist 2020. This poem is close to my heart about my cousins and I gathering around the lake when we are our brownnest in the summer. Lake Baptiste specifically is also on unceded Algonquin territory. So this poem is called Lake Baptiste Ungenders Me. Upon contact, head first, baptismal, the rind of me peels into ribbons of foam and pearls. I rebrown at the water's touch. Its two-way mud mirror hands me my own name. Earth liquid, bottomless, a brown body within a brown body within the lake, the altar of my father's upbringing. Green Sanko, spinner rod, Adidas cleat gender, lifeguard legacy, dive school, dreamboat, jock boy, 5 a.m. wake up call ritual, hereditary, crash boat inheritance. Watch me clear this dock of my torso, no running start with all the other brown boys at jumping rock. Pencil dive into the tubular veins of my lake mother, umbilical, my skin, abalone, parallel to the ice line of the pines, masculine stillness. I muscle myself onto the back of my own back, reaching towards the helm of all the boys born after me. I join the tow, unborn in their wake, slaloming drowned tree honorifics, shirtless, sun chest, eldest child, again, plunging into the holy dark of brown limbs, our edges, the only scenery. In this womb, I am my kin, earth liquid, bottomless, indiscernible from the neck down, limbs, torso, pelvis, could be anyone, could be everyone I love all at once. Upon contact, I sediment the brown of me, coloring the entire lake. I am the dye, fogging up the fresh water, natural unclarity, natural mash, natural churning of the weeds in the motor, Loch-ness, body all scales, brown shimmer, perch, pike, boy, freshwater, mermaid illusion, gill, gasping, water breathing. I spit out every body's hook, submerge in me, and there is only more me, ever brown, edgeless. Thank you all so much. You can finally find me at Myers Cass on Instagram. I appreciate y'all. Go check out your local spoken word artists. I will see you on the interwebs. Bye.
Thank you, Cassandra. That was so powerful. We have a number of questions. People have been really inspired by your work and by your words. For the first question, can you tell us about the significance of the art behind you? amazing frames.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this is just like a collection of art from people I love, from zine fairs, from picking up things off the street, honestly, repurposing and making a home. This is our first home, my wife and I, where we're actually gonna put stuff on the walls and put a nail in. Yeah, there's poems up there from people I love. And for folks who don't know, like I was a visual artist before I was a spoken word artist or like a slam poet. I came into poetry because it's free to write a poem. It's $5 to enter a poetry slam. It's expensive to go to OCAD and buy paint. So I think that's also another brilliant thing about writing poetry, spoken word slam, is that it's accessible to a lot of folks.
Great, thank you. So it's amazing to hear you speak your words, your poem, while we are reading it, the words on the page, while the ALS interpreter is performing the words all at the same time. It provides these multiple layers of experience.
Mm.
When you are creating poetry, how do you experience the words as they emerge from you?
Thanks for asking. I think this is where my madness and chaotic thought lends itself so brilliantly. I see it very cinematically. I see it happening all out in front of me in images as a movie. And when we're talking about survivorship in particular, PTSD, this loss of memory, this lack of details, this lack of chronological clarity, in my poems in particular, I call upon almost like a supercut of image, burst, so that I don't have to offer details that call upon my trauma or that my brain is keeping from me, but instead I can call upon that embodied feeling. The essence of what I know in my gut is what I'm trying to call other folks who have had that experience in, for a place of shelter and a place of refuge. Yeah.
Wow. Just want to sit with that for a second. Thank you. How do you see your work having been altered, or how has it been altered in the context of the pandemic? Both in terms of maybe what the thoughts, the writing, the performance, who, how, where, when, what do you notice?
Yeah, absolutely. In the context of the pandemic, there's been so much conversation specifically in the slam poetry community, because without our venues and without that audience interaction, I've been in a lot of Zoom slams and the vibe is not the same. That energy is not the same, but I think it's called poets who usually perform to get creative and to be viral in different ways, through incorporating visual elements to their Instagram, through photos or personal art, to make it more accessible in that way, to make TikToks where they perform their poetry and include closed captioning text over their poems. And also for folks who might have felt gatekept from publishing to be emboldened to enter the publishing sphere. I feel like I'm one of those people where I didn't feel like I had the credentials to enter a major poetry contest and win against people who had MFAs. But I was just the recipient of a major poetry contest award. And I think what we're seeing is, folks who were traditionally in slam poetry and spoken word exclusively are now winning major publishing awards. Jillian Christmas just won the Writers Trust LGBTQ Writers Award for her book, The Gospel of Breaking. A lot of the folks who were viral slam poets have shifted now into winning major prizes and fellowships and literature awards. So I would say that we're busting open the canon, like we are making space where there was none. And the pandemic has given us that opportunity to show that spoken word isn't only viral online, but is deserving of taking space on TV shows. Like, I'm wondering when it's going to be like the, you know, spoken word equivalent of Legendary, the like new voguing show. We're waiting for it. A spoken word artist just won America's Got Talent. So as much as our close communities are struggling, I think folks are finding new space elsewhere because we've been forced to diversify where we put our art. Yeah.
Do you have any tips for emerging spoken word artists? Where to seek out performance spaces, getting your name out and your work out there? What would you suggest?
That's a fantastic question. I would suggest to stay close to people's art that you enjoy, that are your age. I wasn't really mentored by anyone. I made a collective of other femme poets, and we found encouragement and growth through challenging each other in a very small way. The difficult part about the spoken word community or slam poetry community, just like any other niched art space, is that people get burnt out. And it's always the racialized women that get burnt out first because they end up doing the most labor. And also their careers are sacrificed to do that organizing work. Specifically folks like Janae Johnson, like fantastic spoken word artist, runs like Youth Speaks in the Bay, which puts on like major youth programming, but her presence in Virality and online doesn't get that same platform. So for young people who are trying to build a craft, I would say listen to your gut about what kind of poems you like and emulate that, because I think the other part about being in slam is that I was influenced a lot by what coaches and other people wanted me to be. And I say be weird, be gutsy, you know, like you don't have to make sense. Other people don't have to get it. As long as it speaks to you and your kin, like keep doing that weird work and be so audacious to apply for things that you would never think that you would get. There's so much grant money out there, and I thought I needed to have so many qualifications before I accessed it, but really and truly submit to as many things as possible, and you will receive, just from the fact that you're trying, and that you have an important message to say. I think the youth voice more now, or actually the youth voice always, should be like moving us forward in terms of our discourse and our art, and opportunities for young people while under the nonprofit industrial complex get smaller. I think that we should have the guts to enter adult spaces.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You mentioned burnout. How do you balance burnout and creation?
That's a fantastic question. I think this is where some of my like so-called like counseling or social work, let's call it healing work, comes into play for me. Having an understanding of your body and also like having consensual experiences in community, I think is what will shift burnout. Specifically, like giving folks the option to say no. Folks not doing things for free anymore. A lot of our organizing, you know, I'm an organizing member with the Toronto Poetry Project, and only this year we started paying ourselves to host, to scorekeep, to do all of the roles that it takes to put on a successful event that has 100 people show up. And I think that has to shift in our niche communities, like the dance community, for example. Like no one gets paid in the dance community to run like battles. And I think more space in Canada Council for the Arts, Ontario Arts Council needs to start recognizing slam poetry as a legitimate art form that deserves funding, so we don't have to keep calling ourselves spoken word festivals, because again, there are folks entering that space who aren't honoring that lineage. And I feel like we are co-opting that space to gain access to that funding. So some systemic things have to shift, I think, for burnout to be resolved, but also just more discourse between other femme and racialized folks on how to protect ourselves. And for folks who do have more spoons than us and are more able-bodied or have certain privileges to step in and take instruction from our leadership to carry out roles that we just don't have the energy for. Yeah.
That's a terrific segue into the final question. How can we support you? Can we follow you on social media? Where, how, in other ways, how can we support the fantastic work that you do?
Yeah, so you can find me at Myers Cass on Instagram. I post very rarely there. I'm not trying to go viral yet, but I am going to be putting out a series of work called Body All Pearls, which is about my chronic pain, which will include like drag looks with my spoken word poetry, which I'm really excited about. And I'm going to be putting out my first book called Smash the Headlights, which will entirely be about experiences of survivorship from gender-based violence in 2021 from 2022 spring from Right Bloody Publishing. So when my book comes out, if you would be so kind to put it on your shelf, give it a look, give it a listen. And, you know, always I encourage folks to send me a message if they are trying to enter the spoken word community, if they are looking for new spaces to write, especially if you are queer and trans and BIPOC, because and young, because it's just us. You know, we are trying to do things for us, by us, but sustainably. So if I'm getting paid, we're all getting paid. That's what I'm trying to make happen.
Thank you, Cassandra. Your contribution today has been profound. The work that you do is spectacular and really making a difference, not only in the community, but in the landscape of Canada. It's such a pleasure to have you here. At this point, Marvin, I believe I pass it off to you. And thank you, Cassandra, once more. What a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. And thank you, Cassandra. What stood out to me in your performance was the imagery and the sense of memory and joy and sensuality in the spaces you illustrated. And it's funny because I actually took a course on griots to MCs at York U. So, you know, the things you point to is sort of like a continuing sense of that. But with that, I would like to introduce Catherine Foley, who is the coordinator of Residence Life. And Catherine will introduce our next speaker, Lukayo.
Hi, everyone. As Marvin said, my name is Catherine, and I'm the Residence Life Coordinator at Glendon College. So, a word slinger and healer from the Bicol diaspora, Lukayo is based on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Anishinaabe, Algonquin, in so-called Ottawa, Canada. When not daydreaming of starting a sanctuary centering disability justice with land defenders and non-binary priests and priestesses, Lukayo is probably hanging out and gaming with queer chosen family and or animist Filipino community. For the past year or so, they've worked as the Director of Healing and Accountability at Kind Space. They're at 2S LGBTQ+ Community Center. Check out lukayo.com and kindspace.ca to know more.
So as I begin, feel free to dance. cradles this body, this voice, to the city that covers it by force or by choice, to the earth with its quaking, its growth, and its joys, we thank you. The ancestors' blood that runs in our veins, and known to us all are names of great fame, be they buried close by or far away laid, we thank you. To the Algonquin, the first of this land, original sovereignty by their stewards' hands, to each two-spirit person, to each woman, each man, we thank you. To Black cultures, movements who hold the key to Black poetry's impact on the world and on me, Black liberation means we all must be free, we thank you. To the plants, the four-legged, those who swim, fly, and crawl, to the SexGen organizers and technology for creating this call, to our homes and caregivers, those protecting us all, we thank you. To all those in attendance who lend us their ears, to our support networks who hold us each year, to all those whose influence we hold so dear, we thank you. To Diwata Batala, Creator Divine, to the spirits that guard me, the six that are mine, to Gugarang, St. Bridget, and angels so kind, we thank you. To the land, to the art, to the spirit, to the flesh, to the word, to the voice, to the work, to the quest, we gather in thanks to receive and to give, for we are connected in this world that we live. There is no end to our thanks, but our time is still young, so welcome to this sharing, to this ritual, this show. Hey, so mabuhay. Ako po si Lukayo, Diwata Bitoon. Taga saan Bicol ako. Welcome, my name is Lukayo Diwata Bitoon, or Lukayo Diwata Estrella. I am from Bicol, which is a ethnicity region. Long time ago was the kingdom of Ibalon, around 500 years ago, in southeastern Luzon, which is a large island on the north part of what is now colonially called the Philippines. I was playing a kubing, which is a bamboo harp, to welcome you. This is like arts and activism, right? So let's have some music. Let's have some dance. This talk is called Sayawan alay sa paghilom ng diwa, which is a dance offering to heal the spirit. Yeah, and I'm here to talk about that. Technically, well, not technically, it was a gathering. So it was a gathering in 2019 in August. There was about maybe 30 people. A lot of them were diaspora folks that I get whose ancestry was from the Philippines, and then there were some family members and allies that and Indigenous folks who were speakers, Indigenous to Turtle Island, to the area, as well as Indigenous Filipinos that were also speakers. And we had gathered to do healing. We had gathered to healing through dance and through music and through singing and chanting, and through understanding our responsibilities to each other, to our pre-colonial or Indigenous understanding to the spirit world, and then to our settler responsibilities to the land here. But for me to kind of like explain the whole way that we got to that weekend gathering on Algonquin territory out near Pequawkanagan Reserve. I guess I mean, I'm just gonna have to like tell a little bit of my life story. So there's like a lot of things that got us to that place and what that means around like queer and trans organizing and and arts and like activism as part of all of that. Yeah, so I was born in what's in so-called Philippines, or what's known as Philippines. I say that because I really don't like the name. It was named by Spanish colonizers based on a king who never visited us in any way. So, and basically just sent like conquistadors and colonialists over there. And so that's a long history talk, which I'm not going to get into. but I was born right around the end of the Marcos dictatorship. Also another history talk. So I was 1 year old when the People Power Revolution, or the EDSA Revolution, happened. And that would impact me for years to come around activism. My father was an activist back then, and he had taken my mother, who was pregnant with my brother at the time, to the EDSA, which is like a gigantic highway in Manila, um, to this protest. So, in short, the People Power Revolution, or that day, was just people just started marching the streets. It wasn't really planned. Everybody started joining, started leaving their houses, filled up these 4-lane highways. And then so they sent in tanks and helicopters, and then a wild thing happened where everybody left the tanks and joined the people. And so the Marcos dictatorship fell. They fled to, I think, Australia, as the people stormed Malacanang Palace, I think is where they stay. Yeah, it was a pivotal time in the history, but there was also a lot of civil strife at the time as well. And so my mother's sister wanted our family to be in Canada. So we ended up here. She pulled a lot of strings because our immigration was rejected. And my mother's sister, powerful auntie, may she rest in peace, Auntie Mercy Barbero, Dr. Mercy Barbero, Dr. Auntie Mercy Barbero. And because of, she had a small practice in Scarborough, Ontario. So that's where we ended up settling when we immigrated here. And so I grew up in Scarborough, where over 300 years ago was the Ganatse Kwayagon village and Onondaga or Seneca village of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So that kind of, but I didn't know that at the time. I was a little immigrant kid who was extremely gender ambiguous. But some stuff also happened between the moving, the fall of the Marcos dictatorship and moving to Canada, which would happen in so there were 3 or 4 years where we lived in the Philippines. I was a toddler, and a lot of things happened then that my parents don't like to talk about, but it has really impressed upon me and changed my whole life. And that was the fact that there's a creature called an aswang in the islands, and my family had been attacked by it. And this happened when my mom was pregnant with a child between me and my brother. So it's a very sordid, gruesome story that I never really understood until I was 25. But it helped me kind of connect to the spirit world. And it also changed my understanding of how I connected to the teachings of my people pre-colonially, and also helped me understand why I was so different beyond the fact that I was really gender ambiguous. And when I was growing up in Scarborough, people really didn't like that or thought it was a joke. And so I really struggled with both this capacity to interact with the spirit world in a way that was demonized as scary, or that I would be institutionalized for having hallucinations or all of these things. And then also people were like, you're a weird little kid and we can't tell if you're a boy or a girl. And I didn't know how to talk to my parents about all of this. There's that huge generational gap because I was being raised in the values of North American settler society and Canadian settler society. And my parents had been raised in a completely set of values that also involved strict Catholicism, but our indigenous way of being, or folk Catholicism, underneath that as well. And so their understanding of interconnectedness and filial piety and community versus me being raised in a North American competitiveness and like individuality and pull yourself up capitalist bootstrap stuff. And where it intersected was also like the immigrant mentality where parents are like, you have to look your best and do your best. You have to work 4 times as hard. And we have to gain that prosperity that is the Canadian multicultural dream, which was really difficult because I was already a sickly, weird, gender ambiguous child. And so I managed to I only started figuring things out when I moved to so-called Ottawa of unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory for university. And that's where I encountered my first person that told me they were transgender. I encountered spoken word community. Shout out to Cassandra, who was the speaker before me and did that beautiful history of spoken word. And so, and shared that language about being a guest in spoken word culture. So I also started doing slam poetry in university when I was going to Carleton, and then got into LGBT activism and came out. We didn't have the words non-binary then, so I knew that I was like, I think we use the words genderqueer or gender fluid. So came out as genderqueer, and started being involved in campus LGBTQ activism. And then what really helped kind of turn around my whole life, because I didn't really connect with the white trans narrative that was going on at the time, and I still don't actually, was I went to a camp, a queer and trans camp, as like an adult mentor. And I met a two-spirit teacher named Sharp Doppler, who was doing a decolonization teaching through storytelling and interactive play as part of this camp's, it's called Project Acorn, it's run by the Ten Oaks Project, part of this camp's curriculum, just like that's, everybody has to go learn decolonization. And the way that Sharp told and weaved the story about completely resonated, and I realized there was a lot missing about my understanding of who I was. And it also deeply impacted me. I had a partner die a few years ago, and I had committed to reconnecting to my heritage and my spirituality. So I also started connecting to Filipino migrant activism. And so I've been so I was in the slam poetry community. I was in working with the Philippine Migrant Society of Canada. And then I was also doing LGBT activism. And when I met Sharp, who supported me and invited me to circles that were two-spirit led on the territory to support my healing and understanding of like the complexities of my gender, and which helped supported me researching and rediscovering the non-binariness of like ancient Filipino gender, or what I guess we would call gender now, but just people of like, most of it is like Spanish accounts of like these demons or witches or brujas, they use the words, about people where they weren't wearing the right clothes based on their genitalia. And so, that's that's transphobia today as well. And so I mention all of these influences because I wouldn't be here today without the love and support of two-spirit elders, like Elder Blue, who had done the opening and closing, and is going to do the closing for these events, who really supported me in my healing, and Sharp Doppler, who also was a speaker at the gathering that I'm leading all this up to. I wouldn't be here without Black liberation, the slam poetry and spoken word community, and all of the complexities of thinking about being a guest in spoken word, being a guest in hip hop. Growing up in Scarborough, I was also into hip hop culture. And even in university, I took breakdancing classes to learn the history of hip hop from B-Boy Crazy Smooth. And then after reflecting on that, then started to research the chants and spoken word culture in Philippines as a way to connect deeper to that culture, as opposed to being a guest in Black spoken word or spoken word originating in Black culture. And so while this was happening, it took me to all of these things. And then also like working with like known as illegal and like the migrant society or the Migrante and the Philippine Migrant Society took me to the Center for Babaylan Studies. And so they had these conferences. So I'd connect with folks and ask if they could be my teachers and elders in reconnecting to my culture or decolonizing myself, if you will. But I know using that term is, I'm careful to use that term. So for me, decolonization is also returning the land back and not just like undoing colonial mentality. And so that led me to Pamati gatherings, which were organized by the Tao Foundation, which is led by Grace Nono, who I was also deeply interested in because of her work with Filipino chanting and singing and spoken word. Well, it would just be called chanting. I don't think it's, or poetry, but it's, or epic chanting is the word. They don't call it spoken word. That's a very specific like language that's specific to North America and African American culture. So it was like epic chanting. And through those gatherings, I connected to elders who are still my elders to this day, and who have helped support in understanding the wider call for how reconnecting to the arts and culture of the Philippines is not just about like a cultural resurgence, but also a reconnection to like our spiritual indigenous values that did not have homophobia and transphobia, and can be and is like a healing ceremony, especially for folks who have had to deal with hundreds of years of that pain, of that violence that we intergenerationally hold in our bodies. Like, you know, when I came out to my father and my parents, and I was like, I'm going to choose a different name for myself. And asked them to be part of this process. My father started to open up about all the people in his family that we would consider queer and trans with North American language, about the ways that they died mysteriously, about how he probably suspected many of them died by AIDS, but never reached out for help because of the shame of the suicides and of the murders on his side of the family. And that's in my blood and bones intergenerationally, and so many diasporic Filipino people. And so part of this gathering was to build that. And the last thing that kind of brings all of this together too, and to show like how much queer anti-racist movements support each other, but also like how much brown folks owe so much to Indigenous and Black movements, is the renaming ceremony that Sunset Service did in 2018. Sunset Service, which I think is on hiatus or taking a break or is transforming or is paused, used to be this spiritual organization, Black-led in Toronto. And they offered to put a renaming ceremony for trans folks of color. And so I answered and asked if I could be part of this. And they said, of course. Most of the participants were Black. So I felt really welcomed and lucky and privileged to be part of that. And Elder Patty Wabagon was the one who was opening the ceremony, and Priestess Anania Ayodele was the presiding African diasporic priestess who was holding the ceremony, and had a multitude of assistants also who were so helpful and kind. And I had asked my parents as kind of a way of reconciliation, and to kind of as a healing in our families, and to also show that queer and trans people aren't stories of just like death and murder, and sickness, and that we're also celebrated and loved. I'm going to start crying, so get ready. I always cry when I talk about this. My parents accepted. They were part of the ceremony. Part of it was like I was going blindfolded, and so they had to lead me through this area where a bunch of folks from the queer and trans Toronto community were. And then at some point in the ceremony, the cloth was taken over my eyes, and I was re-welcomed with my name and pronouns, and talked about the history of that name and pronouns. I know I'm over time, so so I'm just gonna kind of wrap it up. But that ceremony, it had music, it had dancing, it had important elements of showing our connection, but also like it had a lot of it was led by spirit and led by reconnecting to our roots and understanding that like the trans narrative for a lot of BIPOC folks is not about just like surgeries and like legal changes. It is about reconnecting to our culture. It's about defying colonization. It's about defying racism and racist trans narratives, and the resurgence of our peoples altogether. And that was really clear at the end of the ceremony, where the priestess was like, I just had a vision. It's not part of the schedule. So I apologize to folks that it's a surprise, but I would like the participants in the center, and then anyone in this room who understands that they are trans and non-binary. A lot of people came out to themselves and everyone that day to be the next circle, and then everybody else outside. And so if you're comfortable, we'll be touching each other's backs or shoulders, depending. And then she just asked the people outside who would consider themselves cisgender to give an oath of protection and a vow that us as trans non-binary people are loved and accepted and celebrated, but also protected by our non-trans relations. Woo! Anyway, so I also wanted to bring more of that healing work specifically to Filipino communities. And so that was part of the organizing around Sayawan, alay sa paghilom ng diwa. I was part of an 8-person organizing committee. Dr. Lynn Gale was there to talk about the history of the Algonquin people and settler responsibility. Shop Doppler was there to talk about Two-Spirit teachings as well. And then an Indigenous Filipino elder was there who is not on the website due to safety and security reasons. There are things going on in the Philippines right now, which we can talk about later. But and so we built that space and that weekend, and the culmination of all of the work and connections and collaboration. It's on pagan-owned land called Ravens Knoll, where the stewards are of European descent and Mohawk descent. And for me and for the folks in attendance, the main thing that I've like from that feedback is that we needed more of this work. We needed more of this work where we're working in tandem with Indigenous communities here. We're working in healing our communities and understanding to bring forward the best that our ancestors had to offer, because we don't just share our ancestors like pain and intergenerational trauma, which we were healing through dance and song and chanting and music, but we were also the culmination of our ancestors' dreams. Yeah, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Maraming salamat po. Gugarang mabalos.
Thank you so much, Lukayo. That was so powerful, and there was a lot there. As a person of Filipino descent, also I'm in Scarborough. I'm
Kamusta?
born and raised in Scarborough, so there's a lot there that I connected to. But I just want to hand it to Catherine, who will sort of go into the questions. Catherine. If Catherine is not present, I can, yeah, I'll go ahead. And this is actually a question that I posed. How might growing up in Scarborough have influenced? How has growing up in Scarborough influenced your work? And you sort of mentioned the diverse communities that you experience, the diverse diasporas. Can you sort of speak to that?
Oh my gosh, Scarborough. I don't. Oh, first, I mean, like, Marvin. I grew up in Catholic school, Scarborough. So, which also Cassandra talked about in their talk as well. But yeah, so a lot of it is just learning other cultures, but also there's a huge Filipino community, and it was so complicated because the community there at the time, or that was surrounding my family, were just, I'll just say it outright, a lot of them are nicer to me now, but they were homophobic and transphobic. And so for a long time I thought all Filipinos are mean. And so I ran into queer and trans white culture. And so that influenced a lot of my work because it took me, I wasn't raised within values that celebrated me, and I didn't appreciate my own culture until way later in my 20s when I reconnected with it, especially during that existential crisis when my partner's death in 2008. 2009. He was also my slam poetry mentor. And so I had to refigure, like, am I going to be a spoken word slam poet for life? Who am I? And what am I missing? What am I losing? Yeah, Scarborough still like influenced my deep love of hip hop. And at the same time, also, I think about that time, and I think about the work that I want to do to reach out to Filipinos in the diaspora who do have like conservative values, who, like, my auntie was a conservative and supported the Mulrooney government. But if she hadn't done that, like, they wouldn't have pulled the strings for me to immigrate here. So it's real complicated because the government rejected our application, and she was a lobbyist with the conservatives, she was able to yell at certain people and then get my whole family here, and which is difficult because my other aunties did not have that, like, didn't have that pull, so they had to come through the live-in caregiver program. So it's a different experience for their children to have been separated from their parents for so long. But my family was lucky enough to come all together because of my doctor auntie's pull with the conservatives. And so there are a lot of Filipino conservatives, and I think about this kind of healing work and supporting Indigenous sovereignty that needs to be done. I think that's kind of how Scarborough influenced me in that way. We are 3 minutes going over time, so I'm going to shorten my answers to something quippy, but I'm not sure if I can.
Okay, that was awesome. How have you navigated your art practices and activism from within the confines of the pandemic?
Oh, the art is hard. I mean, like it's just like Zoom calls, as you know. I'm gonna be doing a storytelling thing probably next month, also on Zoom. But I the activism actually has been more helpful because okay, so as a chronically ill disabled person with like physical mobility issues, I've mostly interacted with the world digitally for a long time while in periods of deep chronic illness. And so the pandemic actually opened up more avenues for me, which made me very bitter, but also relieved. And so I was able to connect with more and more Filipino activists across the world because people just became more used to trying to connect with folks digitally. And there's a 12-hour time difference. So if I'm connecting with an event that's 7 p.m. in Philippines, it's 7 a.m. here, but really supported making deeper connections as well as like diasporic Filipinos. So I've been part of events that are in the Pacific time zone and all of those things.
Nice. You mentioned
Can I,
connection.
sorry, Marvin, can I just interrupt for a second with the
Yeah.
bookkeeping thing? As I've been doing all week at around 12:58. Sorry to interrupt. First, let me say, Lukayo and Cass both, like, I am so delighted that you're here today, and I will not take up lots of time around that, but I'm delighted that you're both here. Anyway, what I need to say for folks who require ASL interpretation or can benefit from captioning for whatever reason, is that we are going to be losing our ASL interpreters likely before our event closes. And so if you go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's two C's, CC for closed captioning. It says live transcript. If you click on that with your mouse and then you go to show subtitle, you will get the kind of machine generated closed captioning that really isn't perfect, but it may be of some assistance to folks who require it. Thank you so much. I'm turning my camera off again.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Chris. Oh yeah, so you mentioned connections. How do you keep your indigenous spiritual values alive and share them today?
Yeah, I basically connect with other people that share those values so that I can um, and connect with the spirit world through like ritual and ceremony and prayer, connect with elders and checking on them during the pandemic. Um, yeah, and it's and then infusing that understanding of ritual, which is that like you are a guest in this body, you are a guest in this timeline, you're a guest on this land. So for me, everything is about being a good guest, to leave this world when I return to the spirit world better than I left it, to leave any place that I reside in better than I left it, to every relationship as a practice into those spiritual values. Whether it's a relationship with this laptop, who is one of my greatest allies every day, taking care of me, or it's the relationship to my cane, to my walker, to my cat that I'm fostering, and am a guest in their life before I return them to the other human that's like as their main caregiver, um, to this home that I just moved into last year. And so that's part of bringing those spiritual values at every moment. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah. I see there's two questions here. I will answer both or one.
Um, yeah, I guess sort of the idea of ritual and the way we perform ritual to connect with memories and uh, the spirit world. What was your experience of coming into the musical practice you shared with us this beginning?
Yeah. So the kubing was being shared at the Center for Babaylan Studies conferences, and I had asked if anybody knew how to teach it. There were a bunch of music teachers, and they showed it, and they were like, "It's very easy to learn. And then I watched some YouTube videos as well. And they were just like, learn from your body, learn from your spirit. And that's kind of how it happened. So I still I feel like I'm still a very beginner learner for this, but basically I watch other people play it at the gatherings. And they were like, would you like to buy one? And I was like, sure. And for me, it connects to me because it's made from bamboo in our creation story. Um, we come from bamboo. And I also sometimes explain to people shorthand that my gender is bamboo because in the beginning, it held both what we would now call lalaki and babae, or male and female. And I hold that too. So I call myself like a bamboo person. And so connecting to this instrument, which just involves like movement of my hands and of my mouth, really helps me connect both to my non-binary gender and to my culture and people in the spirit world. And it's kind of easy to play once you figured it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That sort of reminds me, what I think you and Cassandra both touched on was the sort of knowledge that is embedded in our bodies, and that we must uncover, that we have to uncover, by sort of resisting colonial logics, and I think to explore that knowledge that is so embedded and asks that we embody it, requires so much vulnerability and attention. It sort of connects to the last question here: is how do you keep that feeling and beauty and healing work within you within these times?
Yeah, I mean it's rough. Like I said, I try to do a daily spiritual practice. I also connect with other animist and re-indigenizing Filipinos and indigenous Filipinos just through like gatherings online and phone calls and texts. Um, and this and Discord. So I have this Discord where we talk about teachings together and how to integrate that in our life, and just dreaming and planning. So we were going to have these gatherings before the pandemic hit, and I was going to organize another healing retreat, and we're still hoping to keep doing that. Um, and so, yeah, that's kind of how we do it in this day and age. Thank you.
And I guess last question is, how do we connect with you, and what is the best way? Do you have any social media we can reach out to?
Yeah. Oh, I'm not that great with, I haven't got a tweeter yet. Tweets seem very hard to do. um, as an 80s kid, I don't know. I was born in the 80s, but I didn't grow up in the 80s. Anyway, so it's just lukayo.com. You can find me on Facebook, Lukayo Estrella. I have an Instagram, but it's just lipstick art and cats. So if you like that too. But I keep the Instagram for people who need to message me about like connecting opportunities. Fun fact, why am I speaking for York? I also graduated from York in 2018, which it was not in the bio. And so with an MSW. And so a lot of folks contact me because they know that I know traditional healing practices from the Philippines, as well as counseling, like Western type counseling. And so folks connect me so that they could have like a mix of both, or they're looking for healing. And so that's usually they message on the Instagram or on Facebook. And sometimes for presentation gigs, but I'm more careful about my art because I'm deeply more focused on healing right now. But they're intertwined, as I hope you have seen.
Right. Right. Well, thank you so much, Lukayo. It was an honor. And thank you to Cassandra. Now I'll sort of turn it to Chris and Jin for closing remarks.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Marvin.
Yeah, thank you, Lukayo. Thank you.
Thank you, Lukayo. And Cass.
Yeah.
Catherine.
Yay.
And Carolyn.
That's right. Yeah, all the folks and all the other folks behind the scenes
Yes.
are helping our ASL interpreters who are now off posting.
Ryan Kraft and Heather Crane were our ASL people today.
Probably not Minecraft, which is what the closed captioning said, but Ryan Kraft maybe.
Ryan, yes.
Anyway, okay, so we are just briefly going to say that at 2 o'clock, so in about 50 minutes, there is a meditation session with Scott Pope, which is the last of a series of 4 supportive events put on this by the Center for Sexual Violence Response and Education at York for Pride Week. Yeah. And do you want to say about tomorrow?
Yes.
I'm reversing the order of what we usually do, just to
That's great. And tomorrow we have Kushik Dadui and Mocha Dawkins coming to speak with us. Same time, yes. And it will be, sadly, our last event in this series. And it's not sadly that they'll be here. It'll be amazing that they'll be here. Sadly that this is wrapping up, and we're just so grateful to everyone for such an amazing week of events. Yeah. Anything else, Chris?
Well, if other days are any indication, the video of today's event should be posted by the end of the day. I mean, it's sort of been remarkable how quickly that has happened so far. But I can't make promises that will happen every day. And that you can also see the other folks who've spoken. So you think we'll be able to remember who's spoken on what days?
I will remember.
Oh, amazing.
Raven Wings and Kylie May spoke on Monday.
Mm-hmm.
Hannah Shafi and Pri Rahal spoke on Tuesday. Yiko from Masaka, Uganda, and Alex Rivers spoke yesterday. And today we had Lukayo and Cassandra.
Yeah, Lukayo Estrella and
Cassandra Myers.
Yeah.
And all the videos are on the York site, and you can share them. I've been sharing them on my Instagram and Facebook every day after, and I will tag folks if they would like, but I will get consent before I do that.
Fantastic. And thank you again, especially to Lukayo and Cass for all of the beautiful words that you brought and difficult too, not just, I mean, beautifully difficult, difficultly beautiful, and all of the combinations.
Yes.
But with lots of gratitude. Thank you, everybody.
Yes.
And I think with that, we will put an end to it for today. And
yes.
We will close the Zoom.
See you tomorrow.
Bye.